This morning, I'm very honored to be here with Brenda to discuss the revenue mix for community colleges. And so with that, we'll begin. I'm going to go over the sources of operating revenue, and then Brenda will pick up on the second session, which will be state budgeting process and the impact on community colleges. And then we'll both summarize as we go through. So let's begin. This is a very interesting graphic, and I'm not going to ask you to put this to memory, but it basically just shows you how the economy impacts everything that we do. When the economy's down, of course, there are not resources there for students in their tuition and fees, and the government funds are also reduced. We've seen that happen, and unfortunately for community colleges, we have our greatest enrollments usually during those times when the economy is in trouble because people need to get a new skill or they go back to school during that time. So we're affected by that from our state funds, our local funds, because you guys help us set that tax rate, and you know how important that economy is to that tax rate. And then the federal government funds also are impacted by the economy. When we have a bad economy, they start looking for ways to reduce Pell, reduce grants. So all of that impacts those three major sources of funding that community colleges have. So these are the major operating revenues. That's tuition and fees. And that is set by the local board. And having said that, you know as well as I do that your constituents always are vocal about any increases in tuition and fees. So we're very mindful of that. In addition to that, we're mindful because we are the access to higher education. The higher our tuition and fees go, the less opportunity for those populations that we need to serve. And we know that our Hispanic and other minority populations are growing in the state, and so they are the greatest opportunity for community colleges. Local taxes, as I just said, also you're part of that as well. We have a cap right now on local taxes. We can only increase them by 8%, or we will undergo or could undergo a rollback by the taxpayers. Now, 3% actually, any increase in your taxes you have to have hearings on. So the community is usually very cognizant of any increase in taxes, particularly during a down economy. And there are two components to that. There's your maintenance and operation, which keeps your operating budget, and then if you have a debt, if you go out for special taxes, ad valorem taxes. So those are different. And then, of course, there's the state appropriations, and that has been declining. I am old enough to tell you that I've been in this business over 45 years, not 40, and I have seen a decline all the way from, and nobody believes this, but it really was, 100% of the formula was funded at one time. Not for very long, but it was. Now we're down, and that made our budget about 75% coming from the state of Texas many years ago. But now we're down to about 19%, and you'll see that in a few graphs that we have for community colleges, and that'll vary by college. But it's been declining, and on a steady decline at the same time that costs are going up. So that puts a stretch on the other two sources. Now this is just a graphic that shows you the percent of revenue by source, and it just further exemplifies the fact that the state appropriations have been going down. It varies by institution, how much the tuition and fees have gone up or how much the taxes go up. So this is just a revenue source comparison for 2015. It just shows you, this is the statewide, this is the statewide. It just shows you how it's varied for these different institutions. There's the state average on one side, and you can see the different colleges. If you look at San Jacinto, their tuition and fees are 37% of their budget, while Wharton County, ours are at 59% because we're more heavily dependent upon that. We also wanted to give you a look at two other colleges, Clarendon, which is 53%, a little bit more like Wharton in that respect, and then you look at Tarrant, who has less tuition and fees and more of a tax base. So you can see these varying business models as we go through, dependent on how large the tax base is. And that's the main impacting feature right now, is if you have a large service area and a small tax base, you can see you're having to add to your students' burden of tuition and fees to cover the cost. And this is looking at San Jacinto over a period of time from 2008 to 2016, and how that's varied with the state appropriations you can see are declining, and their tuition and fees have gone up at times, and they actually have held those pretty level, and most community colleges have, and then you can see the taxes have gone up ever so slightly to cover those additional costs. And taxes used to be an agreement between the public, the state, and the community college that the taxes would go more to support the facilities. But over the years, the decline in state appropriation has created that vacuum, and now that's going more for the instructional cost. And then you look at Wharton County Junior College in comparison. We're heavily dependent on tuition fees. You can see that red or orangey color has stayed level as much as we could, but the percentage of the budget has gone up. And you can also see that we have a very small tax base. We serve over 4,000 square miles in Wharton, and yet our tax base is Wharton County and the Needville Independent School District. And we're not the only one in that situation. There are some 15 community colleges, just off the top of my head, that I know of that are in this situation. It's very important for us to service those areas, but we don't have a tax base in those areas. So that is continuing to increase that cost per student. And this is just looking at the fall enrollment for community colleges, and you can tell on that graph that we kind of went up during those times when the workforce needed retraining, the economy was bad, and now we're leveling back off with a little bit of an increase in this fall. And this is looking at San Jacinto College, and it also includes their Pell Grant. You can see that blue. Pell Grant is the amount the federal government authorizes for students. Their eligibility requirements have changed. You've heard a lot about them touting the fact that they did increase the total amount, which was great. We appreciated that. But at the same time, they changed the eligibility requirements, and a number of students lost out on their opportunity to go to school because of the lack of ability to draw the Pell Grant. So it created a real issue for our students. Also, they did away with the summer program, which also created another problem. And I think they're reconsidering that one. At the national level, we're working toward that, Roberto. I think that's one of the trustees' goal, is to get that back as well. So that would help our students. But the support that I want to point out here is that we have those three revenue streams, but the support from the state and the federal government have been declining at the same time that the need is growing for us to educate, both in the skills area and in the academic area. And this is Wharton County, and you can see that we had a little bit of a leveling off, but we have been increasing as well. So there's a little of that. Our Pell has declined somewhat, as some other institutions have, who were hit pretty hard by that eligibility change. And this is looking at the average tuition and fees per semester hour for community colleges in district. And you can look at the state average. It's had a slight increase. San Jacinto is in the red, and you can see they have, the trends are not that different, except that for Wharton County Junior College, it's much higher. We charge a much higher rate for our tuition and fees. And I say much higher. Anything higher is hard for our students. So we've had to be more dependent on that. Out of district, this is another comparison for you. We have been trending to go up on that. Now, for a number of years, some colleges didn't Now the cost to cover those facilities out of our district and all of that are going up, so we're having to increase that. Still a great bargain for the community. And then non-resident is you're out of state, and a lot of us are trending up in that regard as well, because we are a great bargain. The state of Texas is for the rest of the nation. So those students coming in from out of state are paying more. Then we look at property tax, that other component. That component that y'all love to talk about, I'm sure, as board members. So the state property tax, this is for these fiscal years. You can see the valuation, and this is in trillions. It's even hard for me to say that word, but it is trillions. Has been increasing from 2003 at that number, and then all the way up to 1.35 trillion. And then the tax levy, you can see the increase across, and that's the valuation of property has been increasing. The average, though, maintenance and operation, is staying pretty close to the same thing. Where we're going up is in valuation primarily. And then debt, that varies by college, but you can see that the average debt has gone up some over the period of time, but it's still not that significant. And then the average total debt is about 16.8. This was kind of startling to me. I didn't realize this. The property valuation in college districts represents approximately 70% of the state's property wealth. I didn't realize it was that large. The value of property wealth in college districts has nearly doubled since 2003. Now that's the value. That's not the rate. Statewide levy from property taxes has increased 144% since 2003. So you can see why the taxpayers have concerns. It's the valuation of their property that has increased more than our tax rates have. And I know you hear from them and they'll say, my property taxes have gone up, and when you look at it, what you'll see is the valuations have gone up. You haven't gone up, and you'll tell them that, but to their pocketbook, it means it's gone up. And that's the cry we hear in Austin, and it's with the public schools, and of course, we're a much smaller component. So our tax rates have remained stable, and they've remained about 14.3 to 14.5 cents. Now this is a graph of the taxable assets values. This is talking about San Jacinto, and this graph would make you think that Wharton County and San Jacinto are the same, but we're talking about different scales on either side. So you can see that the assessed values in billions has gone up. We had a peak, if you'll look over at Wharton, and I think that is due to minerals during that period of time. And we also had an electric company come in developing electricity, so that helped too. Tax revenue in the millions also. It looks like we're almost the same, but of course it's not. It's a different scale on either side. And you can see we've had peaks and lows in that, dependent on the valuation as well. Now let's look at San Jacinto. This is the property taxes for San Jacinto and Wharton. And you can see that the maintenance and operation for San Jacinto is 12.9, and for Wharton, it's 13.02. So we're very close to the same, but then you look at the property values and the tax base in those two, and there's huge difference between those two. Of course, they serve a lot more students as well. They're in a highly populated area. The debt, San Jacinto has 4.6 now cents, and we don't have any debt. Wharton County Junior College has used revenue bonds in the past, but we're almost to a point now we have no debt. All right, I'm going to stop with that and ask Brenda to come forward and do the state budgeting process.
And this is the best part of the whole thing. No. So I'm trying to psych you up for it. So on the state budgeting process, these are the state sources of revenue. And on that sales tax component, if you look at the state revenue, about 26% of the state budget comes from sales tax. But if you start adding in other taxes such as franchise tax, motor tax, that tax component actually represents about 47% of the state budget. But these are the components that go into the state budget. And this diagram represents how the budgeting cycle works for Texas. So we have a biennial cycle. The Legislative Budget Board, which has the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker of the House, 4 senators, and 4 representatives sitting on that budget board. They and the Governor's Office for Budget and Policy work together to come up with a budget recommendation. So for community colleges, we put together our legislative appropriation request. That was due in on August 5th, and we get guidelines from the state. And they're really not guidelines, you do this, they're requirements. And so for this year, each community college submitted in our legislative appropriations request with a 4% reduction, which is what the state asked for every agency to do. So you work down the left side, the Legislative Budget Board puts together their recommendations. They have a hearing. Community colleges were part of the hearing on September 28th. And then that comes down into the recommendation that is put together between the LBB and the Office of the Governor. That recommendation then, let me see if I goes into this next part of the budgeting cycle. And what this is showing you when the legislature meets, going down the left-hand side is the Senate Finance Committee, and going down the right-hand side is the House Appropriations Committee. And those two groups normally come in with different requests for budgets, and normally the community college budget request is different between both of those. And so through the legislative process, they work through what the recommendation will be to the legislature. This slide has a wrong heading on it. It should continue with the Texas biennial budgeting cycle. And what ends up happening is, as the Senate and the House are coming out with their versions, eventually, as they're nearing the end of the cycle, it goes into, has a committee version, and then the comptroller reviews it, and then ultimately the governor can decide if he approves or not. But that's the process that happens. It starts in January when the legislature kicks off, and then hopefully it ends by the end of May. So on the legislative process, this is important because the 50 community colleges are part of the Texas Association of Community Colleges, and then we have CAT up there, which is the Community College Association of Texas Trustees. We work hand in hand in developing the legislative agenda. And so that agenda really starts working as soon as the prior legislative session ends. And so we had our legislative agenda finalized, working through all the different areas by this past July. And both CAT and TAC have signed off on that legislative agenda, as well as the Texas Community College Teachers Association, which is really important. And at the bottom of there, I say that CAT and TAC work closely with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and we do. And that has really developed over the last few years a close relationship to make sure that we understand the requests and that there's alignment between those requests. The other important thing for the community colleges is we, as an association, have agreed that we don't support special funding requests that go through the legislative appropriation request, the LAR, from other community colleges, meaning we are very united in our request, and that's really important for community colleges. We don't go with, normally, with special funding requests through the LAR process. So state funding for community colleges, while you saw the decline, that state funding is still important to us. And so I want you to understand the model of funding. So back in 1941, we were funded based on full-time student equivalent. This history is important just so you kind of know where we've been and where we're heading and where we hope to be heading. And so you can see there we were funded on full-time student equivalent, and it was based really on the fall enrollment period. Back in 1967, there were about 50,000 students that were attending community colleges versus the 200,000 in 1975 when this model ended. And just think, today we're over 700,000. And then in 1974, this funding model, the full-time student equivalent, got changed to contact hour funding. And it also represented, the formula represented for the whole year that the student was going to school with us. And so we were tracking every semester and then figuring out the contact hours. A funding period for us starts the summer before the legislative session. So for community colleges, our funding period started this past summer. It includes this current fall, and it'll include the current spring. And while you hear from all the community colleges how important student success is, and we're more focused around retention, we also know enrollment is critical, and this funding period is critical. And so we are in a really critical stage right now. The contact hour formula, it's a number of contact hours, and it is tied to then 26 instructional cost areas. So we complete a cost study, and we accumulate our costs by if it's English, if it's math, our health sciences, and so there's 26 different funding models. And so you can see this was our funding method from 1974 through 2014. This is just a nice summary so you can see that difference. And then in 2014, we had a major change in our funding model. And we went from the contact hour funding to a core funding model, student success points, and contact hour funding. And this was the request that went in for 2014 and 15. It was $1.96 billion for all the community colleges. We actually got funded at $1.8 billion. And you can see the breakdown. And going into the 2016-17 funding period, we still maintained core operations, student success points, and contact hour funding. And as we were developing this model, the agreement was that the core funding would be funded off the top, and then the rest of the funding would be split 10% for student success points and 90% for contact hours. When you go through and look at how the funding sources really came together out of this last session when we were funded at $1.75 billion, it averaged out that there was about 2.9% of that going for core funding, 9.7% for student success points, and then 87.2% for instructional funding. There was also a 0.2% hold harmless held out for colleges to make sure they didn't have more than a 10% decline. But if you look at that model, you really have to start taking it back down to institutional level. So core operations is $1 million per institution over 2 years. And if you look at that $1 million, you really have to look at it from a standpoint of an institution. So I'm going to tell you, like Clarendon, that $1 million represents almost 20% of their funding from the state. They get $5 million from the state, and $1 million of that is their core funding. If you look at Wharton, it represents 5.5%. So Wharton's funding from the state was 18% last, or 18 million last session. $1 million of that was their core funding. For San Jacinto College, that core funding is 1.4%. And if you go to Tarrant County, that funding is 0.9%. So for a larger college, that core funding is important, but it is much more important for a smaller college. And so this legislative session, we are requesting that that core funding be increased. But again, we are all funded under this same model. So on the instructional formula funding, you probably wonder, well, what's a contact hour and how does it really tie into funding, into a course? So if government is 3 contact hours, or 3 credit hours, they meet 1.5 hours each Tuesday and Thursday. That means, and they meet for 16 weeks. You calculate that out, and that is 48 contact hours. and then there's 20 students in there, and so that class generates 960 contact hours. We go through and calculate that for every class, and that is then going back and goes against the cost of instruction, whatever that funding rate is that we get. But that is how the instructional funding formula is based. It's based on census date, and so for a fall semester, a 16-week course, it's based on the 12th day of class, and it's basically who's ever enrolled at that point based on these funds. If you look at this instructional formula funding, you can see it was $1.6 billion, and then it's increased to $1.8 billion. There was some declines in there. This doesn't really tell you a lot. It looks pretty stable. What's really important is this next item. If we go and we take that instructional funding and we break it down by the number of students being served across the state, and we do a full-time student equivalent, this is what shows you the real impact. So back in 2002 and 3, based on instructional funding, we received $2,300 and $2,313 per full-time student equivalent. And right now we're receiving $1,851 per full-time student equivalent. And you can see that big dip in 12-13. This is an important way for us to show that formula funding and how it really translates. And Danny from Wharton is the one that told us to put this together last session when we were out begging for money. And, well, it feels like begging, so selling our story. But this tells the story of where there is misalignment around the instructional funding that we receive. So student success points, I want to make sure you understand that. So you got the instructional piece, which is based on people enrolled, and then you've got the student success points. And the goal of the student success points system is really based on, we started working on this in 2010. We looked at what other state systems were doing around student success points. We wanted this to be a performance funding system based on the real mission of community colleges. And we also wanted it to be a system where you could see, no matter what kind of student we were getting, where they were progressing with their achievement. We wanted it to be based on measures that were predictable, based on reporting systems back to the coordinating board, where we really knew the data worked. And then we also wanted to make sure that it was measuring all the students that we managed. So this is a model of the student success points. And you probably can't read that, but it starts out with those students completing developmental education work. And we receive points based on them completing Dev Ed math and then completing Dev Ed reading and writing. Then it progresses through first college credit courses, having students complete college level math and college level reading and writing. And then we receive points as students complete 15 credit hours, 30 credit hours when they transfer and when they earn degrees and certificates. And there is, so a degree and a certificate earns 2 points per student. But if it's a STEM degree, it was 2.25. And then again, you see the transfer. There are gaps along there on ABE and GED and the employment, and I'll tell you about those in just a minute. This gives you another diagram of what we're trying to do with student success points. It takes students from college readiness, their first college level, and then ultimately to attaining additional college credits, transfer, and degrees. Again, the system is based, we can calculate the student success points achieved by every institution on an annual basis. The funding model averages 3 years when we move into the funding cycle. Students can earn multiple points. So if I get college ready this semester and then I pass my college level courses, I'm being counted. It counts dual credit students. That had been one of the concerns in the past also. So if you have a student that starts with you taking dual credit, and then when they graduate, they come back, it counts those. And so it really was trying to capture everything that we do. The holes are ABE, Adult Basic Education, and English as a Second Language. and also GED and employment. We know those are important parts of our mission, but there's not adequate data systems to collect that data right now on how community colleges are doing around these metrics. And so those would be in our future to develop. Okay. So again, it was designed as a system that compares the performance of each community college. Each college is competing against themselves, trying to increase from where they were the prior year. It's calculated annually with a 3-year rolling average. When we went into the 2014-15 system, biennium, we received $185 per student success point. This last session, we received $173 a point. So even though institutions had increased their student success points, because of that reduced funding, many lost money. For San Jacinto College, we increased about 1,700 points and we lost about $500,000 of funding because of that reduced rate. Going into this next session, we are asking for $185 a point, and we're asking for that 90-10 split, 10% student success points, 90 for instruction, to be decoupled. That hurt us in the last session, and we want the student success points to stand on its own. And so if you look at trends from the 83rd session to the 84th session, 43 colleges had increases, but then because of the reduction in the funding per point, 19 colleges received less funding. And the other thing is, as you start to look at it, you can see that overall there was a 6% increase of student success points over the prior biennium. We had increases around the first college credit course being completed, around degrees and certificates, and around transfer. When we designed the student success points, we felt pressure that a performance funding model was coming from the state, and we wanted to design it ourselves. And so we really led that effort from the Texas Association of Community Colleges to make sure we were designing the system. This is how student success points, so across the state, 929,000 student success points were generated last biennium. Just so you can kind of put that in perspective, for San Jacinto College, we were right at 40,000 of the points, a 5.5% increase in the state's points generated per state. Contact hours were 282.9 million, and the contact hours had a decline, meaning that enrollment was down. So you can see the systems work differently. And if you wanted to put, again, perspective around contact hours, so San Jacinto College has about 30,000 students in a fall semester. Our contact hours are right at, just a second, I want to make sure I give you this, are right at 12.3 million for a year. And so think about your institution, and then you can get data around what are your contact hours, what are your student success points, and where are you having measures or increases and changes. But again, the model was designed to meet what community colleges are, our mission. I'm going to turn it back over to Betty, and we are almost done. We've got like 3 minutes. No pressure.
No pressure. Thank you, Brenda. Your favorite topic? I'm going to discuss group health insurance, and I'm going to go through this very quickly for you. Just a little historical information. Prior to 1978, and yes, I do remember this, trying to find health insurance for our employees was very difficult. So in 1978 through 1991, the state provided health insurance appropriation for each eligible employee. In 1991, community colleges were brought into the state employee retirement system. We were actually a good thing for the state because we had lower participation rates, so the state benefited by bringing community colleges in at that time. And then we saw the beginning of a decline of that support. In 2003, physical plant employees were removed from eligibility. And then 2005 to 13, it became a very contentious situation, as you remember. And I had a proportionality, that word that we all liked, and I had actually put out of my mind, had to ask Brenda what it was. So that became an issue with the state. And it was interesting the way that it was viewed. And the more that you put in locally and the less that you got from the state, the more that percentage went up for you. So it was a spiral. The more you would have to put in every year, the less your support from the state. So it continued to be a downward spiral for community colleges. So then we had a conversation, and in the 83rd legislature, we put in a 50-50 agreement, and that is in statute, that the community colleges would pay 50% and the state would then support with 50%. Now, remember all during this that we have a requirement in statute to cover our employees as well. So we don't have a choice whether we're going to cover certain employees or not cover. We have to do that. So at that same time, we went with a 50-50 to avoid that proportionality issue between the state and the community colleges. Other components of higher education are funded at different percentages than community colleges. And there was a little bit of a kicker to that as well that we didn't realize at that time, and that if your enrollment did not grow, then if you added new employees, let's say you're beginning a new program, so you're going to pay the startup cost during that year, you're also going to miss the census date, and if you didn't grow, you're not going to get those new employees covered. So you're going to have to cover those 100%. We didn't realize that. And if you declined in enrollment, then you're also hit with a stipulation that you would have to pay back or not get those monies, some of those monies from the state. So there were several different amendments that came into play that came after our discussions over the 50-50, and we're living with those right now. So for the 2016-17 biennium, about $3.18 million was appropriated by the legislature for community college health insurance. Now, we're very appreciative of getting that money for our employees, but it has become more of a struggle for the community college, and it is part of your financial obligation. So that's what you have to remember as a board member. So it's not just your salaries, it is that component of your benefits. I'm moving, Brenda. This is another thing that has come to play that a lot of us never really thought about, but it's called GASB 68, or the monster on your financial presentation. A lot of you have fund balance, some don't, but if you have what we call, and I still call it fund balance or reserve, and you thought you had $7 million, you well may not have $7 million anymore because you have to book that liability. So the Governmental Accounting Standards Board issued that standard, and the state of Texas then held community colleges accountable for booking that liability. So if you're it's under the teacher retirement system. For Wharton County Junior College, that potential liability was booked at close to $6 million the first year that we had to book it. Now, we're not paying the state $6 million, but you have to reserve it as a liability. You can't use it. So where we thought we may have had that money available for other things, we don't have that money available any longer. For some community colleges, they didn't have it to begin with. So now, when they're looking at things like our accrediting bodies, our bonds that they want to issue, that has to be taken into account as a liability and reduces the available funds your institution has. So it will have a tremendous impact because it will grow every year. Another thing to remember is that we have to cover our retirees. When a person retires, that doesn't mean they come off of your books as a liability or your responsibility. You still have to cover them. Unfortunately, it's only death when that occurs. So it's a lifelong obligation that we have, and we're appreciative of having that for our employees. I'm not going to go further than that because Brenda's looking at me kind of sideways here. So I just want to summarize what I've said. There's 3 primary resources for funding for community colleges. That's not grants or federal money, because those are usually restricted. So just remember that as you're dealing with your budgets.
Change your slide.
Oh, thank you. I was going too fast. So I'm going to let Brenda then summarize some that she has gone over, and then I think we have a few minutes maybe for questions.
And from the state, the biggest pieces to remember are we are funded on a performance funding model. Universities are not, but community colleges are, and student success points at this point represent 10% of our state appropriations. And also, we have the instructional piece and the core funding piece. And core funding is very important for smaller colleges. And then you've heard about the benefit component, and many times we end up forgetting about that. The legislative session is important to us, and as trustees, it is really important for you to participate in that. Roberto's very active, the CAT organization, and I can tell you, Danny from Wharton and other trustees were up here last session making sure that the message was coming out. It's important for you as trustees to be with us. Our legislators want to hear from you more than they want to hear from the CEOs. And so if you have questions about what we presented around our legislative funding model, our state appropriations, ask your CEO. And make sure you understand it, because it really is important of how we move forward. Thanks, and I know we're going to take Ben's time, so if you want to ask us any questions, Betty and I will hang around for a little bit. Thank you.